nose. She'd have a knowing look on her face, and she'd tap the side of her nose, and this had always made Vicky laugh as her imagination went into overdrive. This morning, apart from the newsagent, there was no one about but the dairyman, Billy Pritchard, Dot's father. The street was quiet save for the occasional whinny from his old horse, while Billy was busy delivering fresh pints of milk to each doorstep, just as he always did. Meanwhile, the work-weary nag scented the air, plopping yet another steaming pat of fertiliser onto the cobblestones. "Never mind, pretty Polly?" Lawrence Boardman brought Vicky out of her reverie as he handed her the newspaper. "You know what they say, while there's life." He turned his face skyward. "And looking on the bright side, it might well be another sunny day." Vicky cringed at his use of the sobriquet. She was far too old at 25 to be referred to as Pretty Polly, even as a tease. It was a childhood nickname that harked back to her early days at the old schoolhouse, and she thought it should be left there. The only person she hadn't minded using it after she left school was Stan. She stopped. There was no time for such memories now. It was a new morning, and she needed to face it brightly, as she tried to do most mornings. She pasted what she hoped looked like a patient smile onto her face as she turned to go inside. "Thanks for the paper," she said, and the doorbell jangled once more as she went back into the post office. "Victoria, is that you?" The familiar rasp of her father's voice, followed by a throaty cough, greeted her as she lifted the counter and went through to the small living room behind the shop front, calling, "Yes, it's only me, Dad." But the room was empty. None of the clutter on the small table had been disturbed. Only a disembodied voice wheezed over the banisters from the top of the stairs. "Who was that in the shop? Why have you opened up so early? I haven't had my breakfast yet." Vicky rolled her grey eyes heavenward, an ironic smile tugging at her lips as she stood in front of the mirror over the fireplace where she had left all her Kirby grips the previous night. She pulled her long dark hair off her face, gathering as best she could the wispy tendrils that seemed determined to escape, and sweeping them round her fingers, deftly pinned it all into a neat bun at the nape of her neck. She tried to pinch a bit of colour into her cheeks, and succeeded in highlighting the high cheekbones that she was always being told were her best feature. At least the world hadn't stopped turning, and her father was his usual irascible self. "There's nought to fret over, Dad. It was only me checking the weather," Vicky said, disguising a sigh as she tossed the newspaper onto the table, knocking her father's favourite pipe to the floor. It hadn't had any tobacco in it, since his lungs had been so badly damaged by mustard gas in the Great War, but he liked to suck on it. Like a baby's dummy, she always said, and she couldn't get him to part with it. She tutted as she bent to pick it up, fortunately still in one piece. She stared down at the grim front-page headlines again with the gruesome pictures of tanks and soldiers on the march, and she groaned. Here they were, talking about a new war, while she was still dealing with the consequences of the old one. Life was so unfair. "I've already put the water up and Mr. Boardman next door's sent in the paper," she shouted up to where she could see her father on the small landing at the top of the stairs. "Shall I mash you some tea?" But the only response she got was the sound of more coughing, followed by the slam of his bedroom door. The tiny gong on the pretty clock on the mantelpiece that had once belonged to her mother pinged 9 times, and on the final stroke, Vicky stepped into the post office, just as she always did. She pulled up the blind on the front door and swung the closed sign round to read open. Dr. Roger Buckley was already on the step, as he was most mornings, the first customer of the day. If she was honest, she looked forward to seeing him, though she wouldn't have dreamt of saying so. He was a good-looking man with a high forehead, a strong, smoothly shaven chin, and a perfectly chiselled nose. She considered him to be like an early morning tonic, and she knew from the admiring glances his velvet brown eyes and dark, slicked-back hair drew from most of the women in the neighbourhood that she wasn't the only one who thought so. The village's most eligible bachelor, some said, though in fact he was a widower with a child, and Vicky liked him best when he dropped into the post office at the weekend with his little dog.